The city was alive. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the streets, turning the bustling sidewalks into a patchwork of fading light and growing darkness. It was a city of wealth, of power, of privilege, and yet no one ever saw the people who lived in its shadows. No one ever stopped to look beyond the shiny towers, the immaculate facades of buildings, and the streets lined with expensive cars. Emma Montgomery lived in one of those tall buildings, one of those towers that rose above the city like a monument to everything she had been given. She was the daughter of one of the wealthiest men in the country. Money had never been an issue for her, nor had anything else. She had been raised in a world of security and certainty, a world where the rules were simple and easy to follow, except when they weren't. Emma didn't know it, but she had been living in a bubble. It wasn't a bubble made of glass or plastic. It was a bubble made of silence, a silence that she had built around herself, a silence that was her protection. She hadn't spoken in years, not truly. No one knew why, but no one asked either. Her life had been one of isolation. She moved through it like a ghost, always present but never really seen. She had grown used to it, and in many ways it was safer that way. The world outside her bubble seemed too loud, too messy, too full of things that didn't make sense. She couldn't bear it, not after everything that had happened to her. But that day something shifted. It started with the window. Emma stood in the same place she always did, staring out across the city. The lights were just starting to flicker on, turning the city from gray to gold. From her father's penthouse, she could see everything, the endless streets, the tall buildings, the cars moving like ants below. It was beautiful in a way that only wealth could make things beautiful, but something in the scene didn't feel right today. She noticed him for the first time. There was a boy standing on the street corner. He didn't belong. There was something about the way he stood there, something about his posture. It wasn't that he was out of place, it was that he was always out of place. His clothes were worn, his shoes were old, and there was a roughness to him that Emma hadn't seen before. He was looking up, his gaze sweeping across the skyline, but when his eyes caught hers through the glass, it wasn't like the way most people looked at her. There was no awe, no admiration, no curiosity. There was only knowing. Emma froze. For a brief moment, she wasn't sure what it was, but there was something in his gaze that unsettled her. It wasn't a feeling she was used to, not one she had experienced before. She wanted to look away, but she didn't. She just stood there staring down at him as he stood still, as if waiting for something she couldn't name. She didn't know who he was. She didn't know where he came from. She didn't know anything about him. But she couldn't stop thinking about him. Every time she walked to the window, she saw him there, standing still, his eyes locked on the city but never truly belonging to it. Days passed and the feeling in Emma's chest grew stronger. Something was pulling her toward him. Something was calling to her, and she didn't know how to answer it. One afternoon, when the streets were quieter, when the light was softer, Emma left the safety of her home. She had done this before, yes, but only in moments when the world felt like it was closing in on her, when the silence in her life became unbearable. She was used to hiding from the world, used to retreating into her father's world of wealth and isolation. But today was different. Her feet led her to the alleyway where she had first seen him. The streets felt empty as she walked. No one was around, and she was alone, her heart pounding as she approached the corner. And there he was. He sat on the steps of an old building, one that was clearly forgotten, one that had seen better days. His eyes were fixed on something far away, something Emma couldn't see. He didn't look up when she walked closer. He didn't acknowledge her at all. For a moment, she stood there, unsure of what to do, unsure of why she was even here. But then he looked up. For the first time, their eyes met, not through glass, not through a distance, but up close in the flesh. His eyes were dark, like the city itself, but there was something about them that made her feel as though he could see right through her. Not in a way that made her feel exposed, but in a way that made her feel known. His name was Jamal. He told her without any preamble, without any introduction, just Jamal. He was around her age, but something in the way he spoke told her he had lived a lifetime more than she had. His voice was rough, but there was a quiet strength to it. "I live here," he said, nodding toward the alley. "Been here all my life." Emma didn't know what to say. She had no words for the situation. She had no idea what to make of it, so she stood there awkwardly. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel like she was in control. Jamal didn't ask her why she was there. He didn't ask her what she was looking for. He didn't ask her anything. He just let her be. She felt something stir in her chest, something that had been buried for so long that she had almost forgotten it existed. It wasn't until a few days later that she saw him again. She was walking the streets of the city, her mind heavy with thoughts she couldn't quite piece together, when she saw him again. He was standing at the edge of the sidewalk, looking up at the building. She didn't hesitate this time. "Jamal," she called softly, stepping toward him. He turned slowly, his gaze still distant but not as cold as it had been. This time he saw her. This time there was no hesitation, no avoiding. He didn't look at her as if she were just another person in the crowd. He looked at her as if she were real. "What do you want?" he asked. His voice wasn't unkind, but it was guarded. Emma didn't know what to say, so she just stood there for a moment, waiting. It felt like the world had stopped, like the distance between them had grown wider and narrower all at once. "I want to know your story," she said, her voice quiet but firm. Jamal's eyes flickered for a moment, and then for the first time he gave her a smile. It wasn't much, a slight curve of his lips, but it was something. And it made Emma's heart race. "You really want to know?" he asked, his voice laced with curiosity. "Yes," she said, stepping closer. "I want to know everything." Jamal paused, his gaze turning toward the city skyline and then back to her. "You're going to wish you hadn't asked." And just like that, Emma's world shifted again. She had no idea what she was about to hear, no idea what was coming next. But she knew one thing, her life would never be the same. Jamal took a deep breath and began to speak, his words slow but deliberate. He spoke of his childhood, of the neighborhood he had grown up in, a neighborhood that had always been overlooked, ignored by the rest of the city. He told Emma about the struggles he and his family had faced, about the way they had been pushed to the margins, the way people had looked away when they saw his skin, when they saw his poverty. He spoke of the injustices that had shaped his life, the discrimination that had been so ingrained in society that it was invisible to most people. As he spoke, Emma felt her world unraveling. She had never heard anything like this before. She had heard about injustice, of course. She had read about it, watched documentaries about it, even had conversations about it. But hearing it from Jamal, hearing the pain in his voice, made it real. It was no longer a distant problem. It was something that was happening right in front of her, to people like Jamal, people she had never really seen before. He talked about the times he had been pulled over by the police for no reason, the times he had been told to leave a store simply because he didn't look like he belonged. He talked about the way people crossed the street when they saw him walking, the way they avoided eye contact, as if his very presence made them uncomfortable. But what struck Emma the most was when Jamal spoke about the day he had lost his father. His voice faltered for just a moment, and Emma felt a lump form in her throat. His father had been a good man, a hardworking man who had done everything he could to provide for his family, but it wasn't enough. No matter how hard he tried, the system had crushed him, and in the end, it had taken his life. "People like me," Jamal said quietly, "we don't get to win, we're not even allowed to fight." Emma stood there, her mind spinning, her heart breaking. She had never known what it was like to live with that kind of fear, that kind of hopelessness. And yet here it was laid bare before her. She had always thought that if you worked hard enough, you could make it. But now she understood. For people like Jamal, the system wasn't just unfair, it was rigged against them. Jamal finished speaking, his words hanging in the air between them like a weight. Emma didn't know what to say. She wanted to comfort him, to tell him that everything would be okay, but she knew better. She knew that those words would mean nothing. She didn't have the answers, she didn't even know where to start, but one thing was clear. She couldn't go back to the way things were, not after hearing Jamal's story, not after seeing the truth. Emma stood there in the silence, her mind racing with everything Jamal had just shared. She felt overwhelmed, suffocated by the rawness of his words. They weren't just stories. They were his life, his lived experience, a reality that Emma had been blind to for so long. She had read about racism, heard about it in the news, but it had never hit her like this. She had never had to confront it so directly, so intimately. Jamal wasn't just a victim of injustice. He was living proof of how deep the problem ran. His words were a window into a world that had been hidden from her, a world that she had been shielded from by the wealth and privilege that had surrounded her. She had never been forced to see the truth, but now it was all she could see. As Jamal finished speaking, there was a heavy pause. Emma tried to swallow the lump in her throat, but it wouldn't go away. She had been living in a bubble, and now that bubble had burst. What could she possibly say? What could she do? The world she had known felt small and distant now, like it had been built on a foundation of lies. "Jamal," Emma's voice was soft, hesitant. She wasn't sure what she wanted to say, but something had to be said. "I had no idea. I never knew it was like this." Jamal didn't respond right away. Instead, he looked at her with an unreadable expression. His eyes weren't angry or resentful, just tired. He had said what he needed to say, and now he was waiting for her to process it. He was waiting for her to understand. "You didn't know," he said finally, his voice quiet but steady. "And that's the problem. People don't know, they don't see it, they don't want to." Emma nodded slowly, taking in his words. She had been guilty of it herself. She had lived her life in a bubble, comfortable in her world of privilege, never truly seeing the struggles of those outside of it. She had heard the stories, sure, but hearing them was different from living them, and now that she was faced with the truth, she didn't know how to make sense of it. "Is there anything I can do?" she asked, the question hanging in the air between them. Her voice wavered slightly, unsure, as if she was asking for permission to help, but not knowing how. The words felt inadequate, but they were the only ones she had. Jamal looked at her for a long moment, as if weighing her sincerity. "You want to help?" he asked, his tone almost cynical but not unkind. "Then do something about it. Speak up. Don't just walk away like everyone else. People like me, we've been fighting this fight for so long, and no one listens. But maybe if people like you start speaking out, things can change." Emma's heart sank. She had never considered speaking out. She had never thought she needed to, but Jamal was right. Her silence had been complicity. Her ignorance had been her shield, but it was a shield that had kept her from seeing the truth. She felt the weight of the responsibility fall on her shoulders. It wasn't enough to feel bad. It wasn't enough to acknowledge that there was a problem. She had to do something. She had to be willing to give up the safety of her bubble and fight for what was right. But what did that even look like? How could someone like her, someone with so much, make a difference? Jamal seemed to sense her confusion. He gave her a small, almost reluctant smile. "It's not easy. It's never easy, but it's the only way." Emma stood there, processing his words, feeling the weight of the world pressing down on her chest. She had never felt so small, so powerless, but at the same time, she knew that she couldn't ignore it anymore. She couldn't go back to the life she had been living before. Not now. Not after seeing everything Jamal had shown her. "What happens now?" she asked, almost as if she was asking for permission to take the next step. She didn't know what that next step was, but she knew she couldn't stay here, in the place of ignorance, in the place of silence. She had to do something. Jamal's gaze softened slightly. "You start by listening. You listen to people like me. You listen to the stories. You hear them, really hear them, and then you speak up. You speak up when you see injustice, when you hear someone say something wrong, when you witness something that isn't right. It's not enough to just be aware of it. You have to act." Emma nodded, absorbing his words. It seemed simple enough, but she knew it wasn't. She had lived her life in a way that had protected her from seeing the ugliness of the world, but now that protection had been ripped away. She couldn't unsee the truth. She couldn't walk away from it. She left Jamal's side, her heart heavy, but with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt before. The world outside her father's penthouse seemed so much larger now, so much more complex, and yet so much more real. As she walked through the streets, she couldn't help but notice the people around her, their faces, their eyes. She saw them differently now. She saw the way people moved through the world, the way they interacted with each other, the way they looked at people who were different from them. She saw it all and it hurt. It hurt in a way she hadn't expected, in a way that made her feel small and helpless. But at the same time, it made her feel alive. She had to do something. She couldn't go back. Her first steps toward change weren't easy. She spoke to her friends, the people she had known her whole life, people who lived in the same world she had. She tried to explain what Jamal had shown her, but it was like trying to speak a different language. They didn't get it. They couldn't see what she was seeing. They didn't understand why it mattered. To them, racism was something distant, something that happened to other people, far away. It wasn't a part of their world. And when Emma tried to challenge their views to make them see, they pushed back. "It's not that simple," they would say. "You can't just fix the world with your words." But Emma wasn't deterred. She knew it wasn't simple. She knew it wasn't easy. But she also knew that silence was complicity, and she could no longer remain silent. She kept going, even when the resistance felt overwhelming. She began volunteering at a local community center, helping with youth programs, and speaking to kids in the neighborhoods she had never dared to visit. She learned about the struggles they faced, the obstacles that seemed insurmountable. And every story she heard, every face she saw, made her realize how much more there was to do. But no matter how much she did, there was always more. More kids who needed help, more families living in poverty, more people suffering from the effects of racism and injustice. Emma could feel the weight of it pressing on her, and yet she kept going, because she knew that this was only the beginning. One afternoon, as she walked through the streets of the city, Emma's thoughts were interrupted by the sight of Jamal again. He was standing across the street, leaning against a brick wall, looking up at the sky. She walked toward him, her heart pounding with a mix of anticipation and fear. She had been speaking out, doing everything she could, but she wasn't sure it was enough. She didn't know if she was making a difference. "You're making a difference," Jamal said, as if reading her mind, his voice steady and sure. Emma stopped in front of him, her eyes meeting his. She wanted to ask how he knew, but she didn't need to. His smile said it all. "Keep going," he said, his words simple but powerful. "We all need to keep going." The weight of everything Emma had learned, everything she had seen and heard, had settled deep into her bones. It wasn't just the images or the stories that Jamal had shared with her. It was the realization that she, like so many others, had been living in a world that ignored the suffering of people like him. She had spent her life in the comfort of her father's wealth, surrounded by luxury and security, and had never once questioned the system that allowed her to live that way while others lived in fear, in poverty, and in oppression. But now it wasn't enough to simply feel guilty. It wasn't enough to just care. Emma had learned that caring in itself wasn't enough. She had to act. She had to speak out. She had to be a voice for the voiceless. The fight wasn't hers to fight alone, but if she had any power to change the system, any ability to disrupt the status quo, she had to use it. As she spent more time with Jamal and others in the community, Emma began to understand the immense weight of what it meant to be part of a system that perpetuated inequality. She visited schools in impoverished neighborhoods, spent time with families struggling to make ends meet, and listened to the stories of people whose voices had been drowned out by society's indifference. Every day she saw the glaring disparities, the gap between the lives of those with power and those without, the difference between how people like her were treated and how people like Jamal were viewed. She began to speak out publicly, first on social media, then in community meetings. She wrote articles about the injustice she had witnessed, attended rallies, and joined grassroots movements dedicated to reform. But every time she spoke, there was resistance. People, many of them people she had once called friends, pushed back. They didn't want to hear it. They didn't want to confront the ugliness that was woven into the fabric of their society. They called her naive, idealistic, and even divisive. And yet Emma didn't stop. It hurt, of course. It hurt to be rejected by people she had known for so long, people who had shared her life, her privileges. It hurt to see them turn away when she told them the truth, but every time she faced that resistance, she remembered Jamal's words, "Speak up, don't just walk away." She had been walking away for so long, hiding behind her silence, behind the walls that had separated her from the world, but those walls were gone now. She had seen the truth, she had heard the stories, and now she couldn't unhear them. Her activism wasn't just about speaking out, it was about educating herself, learning everything she could about the systems that created and perpetuated inequality. She read books on systemic racism, on privilege, on history, real history, not the sanitized version she had been taught. She spoke with experts, attended workshops, and learned how to navigate the complex terrain of social justice activism. She understood now that it wasn't just about helping people, it was about dismantling the systems that kept them oppressed. But even as Emma dove deeper into the work, she struggled with doubts. Was she really making a difference? Could one person's actions really change anything? Was the world even capable of change? One evening, after a particularly long day of meetings and outreach, Emma found herself standing on the balcony of her father's penthouse once again, looking out over the city. It was a city that had always been hers, a city she had always taken for granted. But now, as she stared at the sprawling metropolis beneath her, she saw it through different eyes. She saw the disparity. She saw the struggle. She saw the people who had been ignored, sidelined, and oppressed for far too long. Jamal had taught her to see, but seeing, she had learned, was only the first step. The real work came after. The real work was hard, uncomfortable, and sometimes even painful. It was about making the powerful uncomfortable, about challenging the systems that had been in place for generations. It was about standing up and saying, "No, this is not okay." Her phone buzzed in her pocket and she pulled it out, glancing at the message. It was from Jamal. "You coming to the rally tomorrow?" Emma stared at the message for a moment, her heart beating faster. The rally was for police reform, for accountability, for an end to systemic violence against Black communities. It was something she had been working on for months, something she had pushed for tirelessly. She had spoken at countless meetings, met with lawmakers, joined the local activist community, but tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow she was going to stand in front of a crowd of thousands, calling for justice. Tomorrow, she was going to speak up in a way she hadn't before. The nervousness crept in. What if she wasn't ready? What if her words didn't matter? What if no one listened? What if it was all for nothing? But then she thought about everything Jamal had shared with her. She thought about the kids in the community who had been ignored, the families who had been silenced. She thought about the people who had been fighting for change for years, some of whom had lost their lives in the process. She couldn't back down now. She had already seen too much. She typed back a quick response, "I'll be." The next day, Emma arrived at the rally early. She wasn't sure what to expect, but when she stepped out of her car and saw the crowd gathering, a surge of energy hit her. There were people of all ages, races, and backgrounds, people who had come together because they believed in the cause. They were angry, yes, but they were also hopeful. Hopeful that change was possible, that their voices mattered. She walked through the crowd, nodding at familiar faces, taking in the chants and the signs, the energy that pulsed through the air. But then, as she reached the front of the rally, she saw Jamal. He was standing there, looking out at the crowd, his expression focused but calm. Emma approached him, her heart pounding. "You ready?" she asked. Jamal looked at her and smiled. It wasn't the same smile from before. This one was filled with purpose, with determination. "Always," he said. They both turned toward the stage as the speakers began to call people to action. Emma's pulse quickened as she realized she was next. She had been invited to speak, to tell her story, to speak for those who couldn't. When she finally stepped up to the microphone, the crowd fell silent. The weight of their eyes, their expectations, pressed down on her. Emma took a deep breath and began to speak. "I was just like all of you," she began, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I lived in a bubble. I lived a life of privilege, unaware of the struggles that people like Jamal, people like so many of you, face every single day. I didn't know what it meant to fight for justice. I didn't know what it meant to have your voice silenced, to be pushed aside by a system that was built to keep you down." Her voice broke slightly, but she pushed on. "But I do now," she said. "I know that silence is complicity. I know that ignoring the pain of others makes me just as guilty as the systems that perpetuate that pain. And I know that I can't stay silent anymore. We all have to fight. We all have to speak up. It's not enough to care. It's not enough to feel bad. We have to act. We have to make the world hear us." The crowd erupted into applause, and Emma felt a rush of relief. But more than that, she felt something else, something she had never felt before. She felt empowered. She felt like her voice mattered. As she stepped away from the microphone, Jamal was waiting for her. He didn't say anything, but his smile spoke volumes. She had done it. She had taken the first step, and she knew in that moment that this was only the beginning. There was so much more to do, but as long as she kept speaking out, as long as she kept fighting, maybe, just maybe, things would change. And if not, she would keep fighting anyway, because the world wasn't going to change by staying silent. The world wasn't going to change if everyone kept looking away. It was up to all of them. It was up to people like Emma, people like Jamal, to make sure the world saw the truth. And maybe, just maybe, that truth would change everything.